Part 1. The night everything changed. The emergency room was finally quiet after 12 hours of chaos. Dr. Lisa Thompson pulled off her scrubs and looked at the clock hanging on the break room wall. 2:47 a.m., another night shift was over, and she could barely keep her eyes open. Her feet ached from running between patients all night, treating everything from heart attacks to car accidents. Lisa had been working as an emergency room nurse for 8 years. She loved helping people during their worst moments, but nights like this reminded her why the job was so hard. 3 gunshot victims, 2 overdoses, and a family car crash had kept the entire staff running without a break. But that was the life she chose, and she wouldn't change it for anything. She grabbed her purse from her locker and walked toward the parking garage. The hospital was located in the heart of the city, and even at this hour, she could see a few people walking around downtown. The cool night air felt good on her face after being inside the stuffy hospital all evening. Her car was parked on the 3rd level of the garage. As she walked, her phone buzzed with a text message from her husband David. He was away for work again, training new agents at a facility 3 hours away. The message was simple. "Hope your shift went well. Love you. See you tomorrow." Lisa smiled and typed back quickly. "Long night, but everyone's okay. Drive safe coming home. Love you too." David worked for the government, though he rarely talked about the details of his job. All she knew was that he trained federal agents in tactical situations. He'd been doing it for 15 years, and he was good at it. Good enough that they kept sending him to different training centers around the country. The drive home took 20 minutes through empty streets. Lisa lived in a quiet neighborhood called Maple Heights, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and kids rode bikes in the street. She and David had bought their house there 5 years ago because it felt safe and peaceful. It was exactly what they both needed after dealing with stressful jobs all day. As she turned onto her street, Lisa noticed how dark everything looked. Most of the streetlights were working, but a few had burned out, creating long shadows between the houses. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment, feeling the exhaustion hit her all at once. Their house was a simple 2-story building with blue shutters and a small front garden that David loved to work in during his free time. The porch light was still on, just like she'd left it that morning. Everything looked normal and peaceful. Lisa got out of her car and walked to the front door, fumbling with her keys in the dark. She could hear a dog barking somewhere down the street, but otherwise, the neighborhood was completely quiet. Once inside, she dropped her purse on the hall table and kicked off her shoes. The house felt empty without David there. He'd been gone for 3 days this time, and she always missed having him around. They'd been married for 10 years, and she still looked forward to hearing about his day when he came home from work. Lisa walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water before heading upstairs to bed. She flipped on the light and opened the refrigerator, grabbing a bottle of water. As she closed the fridge door, she heard a noise outside that made her pause. It sounded like a car door slamming, but that seemed strange at this hour. Their neighbors were all families with young kids who went to bed early. She looked out the kitchen window but couldn't see anything unusual in the darkness. Lisa shrugged and opened her water bottle. She was probably just tired and hearing things. Working night shifts for years had taught her that her mind sometimes played tricks on her when she was exhausted. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Robert Kane was having one of the worst nights of his career. He'd been a police officer for 12 years, but lately everything seemed to be going wrong. Earlier that evening, he'd gotten written up by his supervisor for being late to work again. His partner had requested a transfer to a different shift, and his wife had called to tell him she was filing for divorce. Kane was driving his patrol car through the downtown area when his radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice cut through. "The quiet night, Unit 47. We have a possible breaking and entering at 1247 Oak Street in Maple Heights. Neighbor reports seeing suspicious activity." He grabbed his radio and responded, "Unit 47 responding." Finally, something to do that might help him forget about his personal problems. The address was about 15 minutes away, in one of the nicer parts of town. Kane had been to Maple Heights before for minor calls, usually noise complaints or minor fender benders. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where serious crimes happened very often. As he drove, Kane's mind wandered to his conversation with his wife earlier. She'd told him she couldn't handle being married to a police officer anymore. The stress, the long hours, the danger, it was all too much for her. They'd been fighting for months, and tonight she'd finally said what they both knew was coming. Kane pulled onto Oak Street and looked for house number 1247. The street was dark and quiet, with most houses showing no signs of life. He spotted the address and noticed that there were lights on inside, which seemed strange if someone was breaking in. He parked his patrol car across the street and sat for a moment, trying to focus on the job instead of his personal problems. The house looked normal from the outside, a typical suburban home with a neat front yard and a car in the driveway. Kane got out of his car and walked toward the house, his hand resting on his service weapon out of habit. He'd responded to hundreds of these calls over the years, and most of them turned out to be false alarms. Sometimes neighbors got nervous about shadows or unfamiliar cars, and they called the police just to be safe. As he approached the front door, Kane could see movement inside through the kitchen window. Someone was definitely in there, moving around near the refrigerator. He couldn't tell who it was or what they were doing, but his training told him to be careful. Back inside the house, Lisa finished her water and started turning off the lights. Downstairs, she was looking forward to a hot shower and finally getting some sleep. Tomorrow was her day off, and she planned to spend it doing absolutely nothing productive. As she reached for the kitchen light switch, she saw a figure moving outside the window. Her heart jumped, and she stepped back from the window, trying to get a better look at who was in her backyard. The figure appeared to be wearing some kind of uniform and was walking toward her back door. Lisa's mind raced as she tried to figure out what was happening. Was someone trying to break in? Should she call 911? Then she remembered David's advice from years ago. If something ever seemed wrong, trust her instincts and call for help immediately. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, she heard a loud knock on her back door. "Police! Open!" "Up!" came a voice from outside. Lisa felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was just a police officer, probably checking on something in the neighborhood. Maybe there had been a break-in nearby, and they were going door to door to make sure everyone was safe. She walked to the back door and called out, "Just a minute!" She wanted to look through the peephole to make sure it really was a police officer before opening the door. Outside, Kane was getting impatient. He'd been having a terrible night, and now he was standing in someone's backyard at 3 in the morning dealing with what was probably another false alarm. His supervisor's criticism from earlier was still ringing in his ears, and his wife's words about divorce kept playing in his mind. When he heard movement inside the house, Kane's training kicked in. Someone was definitely in there, and they were taking too long to answer the door. In his experience, innocent people opened doors quickly when police identified themselves. The next 60 seconds would change everything for both of them. Setting in motion a series of events that would shake their quiet community to its core and reveal truths that neither of them could have imagined. Part 2. The cover-up begins. The emergency call came in at 3:22 a.m. Officer needs assistance. Shots fired at 1247 Oak Street. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood of Maple Heights was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. Police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks lined the street as neighbors peered out their windows, trying to understand what had happened in their peaceful community. Sergeant William Torres had been sleeping when his phone rang. As the night shift supervisor, he was used to getting calls at all hours, but something about this one felt different. When the dispatcher told him that Officer Kane had been involved in a shooting, Torres knew this was going to be a long night. He arrived at the scene 20 minutes later to find Kane sitting in the back of an ambulance, staring at his hands. The officer looked shaken, his uniform disheveled, and his face pale under the streetlights. Torres had known Kane for 5 years, and he'd never seen him like this. "What happened here, Kane?" Torres asked, sitting down next to him. Kane looked up slowly, his eyes unfocused. I thought she was going to hurt me." She came at me with something in her hand. I couldn't see what it was in the dark. Torres nodded and made notes in his small notebook. He'd handled officer-involved shootings before, and he knew the next few hours would be critical. The department's reputation, Kane's career, and potentially several lawsuits all depended on how this situation was managed. Inside the house, crime scene investigators were already at work. Lisa Thompson lay motionless on her kitchen floor, still wearing the scrubs she'd worn during her shift at the hospital. Next to her hand was a cell phone. She'd been trying to call 911 when Officer Kane entered through the back door. Detective Amy Rodriguez was the lead investigator assigned to the case. She'd been a detective for 8 years and had worked dozens of crime scenes, but walking into Lisa's kitchen made her stomach turn. The young woman looked like she could have been sleeping if not for the obvious signs of what had happened. "What do we know so far?" Rodriguez asked one of the crime scene technicians. "Victim is Lisa Thompson, 29 years old, works as a nurse at City General Hospital. She was apparently just getting home from her shift when this happened." Number. Signs of forced entry, no evidence of any criminal activity. Rodriguez walked around the kitchen, taking pictures and making notes. Something about this scene didn't feel right to her. If Kane had responded to a burglary call, where were the signs of a break-in? Why was the victim still in her work uniform? And why was she in her own kitchen at 3 in the morning? Outside, Sergeant Torres was already working on damage control. He called his captain, then the department's public relations officer, and finally the police union representative. Everyone needed to be on the same page before the media got wind of what had happened. "We need to control the narrative here," Torres told Officer Kane. "The newspapers are going to want to make this look bad for the department. We have to stick to the facts and make sure everyone understands that you were just doing your job." Kane nodded absently. He kept replaying the last few minutes in his mind, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. The woman had seemed surprised to see him, but she hadn't looked threatening. She'd been holding something, but now he wasn't sure what it was. Everything had happened so fast. By dawn, the department's story was already taking shape. Officer Kane had responded to a burglary call from a concerned neighbor. When he arrived at the scene, he found someone inside the house acting suspiciously. Fearing for his safety in a dark, unfamiliar environment, he had been forced to defend himself when the suspect made threatening movements. The police union representative, Frank Miller, arrived at the station just as Kane was finishing his written statement. Miller had been protecting police officers' rights for 15 years, and he knew exactly how to handle situations like this. "Don't talk to anyone without a lawyer present," Miller told Kane. "Don't talk to the media, don't talk to investigators from other departments, and don't even talk to your friends about what happened. The department will handle everything from here." Meanwhile, 3 hours away, David Williams was packing his bags at the federal training facility where he'd been working for the past week. His phone had been on silent all night, and he hadn't seen the missed calls until he woke up that morning. When he finally checked his messages, there were 17 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize and 3 voicemails from the local police department. His hands started shaking as he listened to the first message. "Mr. Williams, this is Sergeant Torres with the Maple Heights Police Department. We need you to call us immediately regarding your wife, Lisa Thompson. It's urgent." The drive home was the longest 3 hours of David's life. The police had told him there had been an incident at his house but wouldn't give him any details over the phone. They just kept saying he needed to come home right away. David had been training federal agents for 15 years. He'd seen crime scenes, he'd dealt with dangerous situations, and he thought he was prepared for anything. But nothing could have prepared him for walking into the police station and being told that his wife was dead. "There was a misunderstanding," Sergeant Torres explained, choosing his words carefully. "Officer Kane responded to a burglary call at your address. Your wife was inside the house, and in the darkness, there was confusion about her identity and intentions." David stared at Torres for a long moment, trying to process what he was being told. A burglary call? Lisa was coming home from work. She's a nurse. She was supposed to be getting home around 3. We understand this is difficult. Torres continued. "But we want you to know that Officer Kane followed proper procedures. He identified himself as police, and when your wife made movements that appeared threatening, he had to make a split-second decision to protect himself." The meeting lasted an hour, but David barely heard most of what was said. Torres and the police union representative kept talking about procedures and protocols and unfortunate misunderstandings. They mentioned that the officer involved was devastated by what had happened and that the department would be conducting a full investigation. What they didn't mention was that Officer Kane had a history of complaints from citizens about excessive force. They didn't mention that he'd been written up 3 times in the past year for violations of department policy. And they definitely didn't mention that the burglary call had been based on a neighbor seeing lights on in a house, lights that belonged to Lisa, who was simply coming home from work. By the time David left the police station, the department's public relations team was already crafting press releases. The story they planned to tell the media was simple. A dedicated police officer had responded to a possible crime in progress and had been forced to use deadly force when confronted by an unknown individual in a dark house. Detective Rodriguez spent the rest of the morning interviewing neighbors and collecting evidence. The more she learned about Lisa Thompson, the more uncomfortable she became with the department's version of events. Lisa was a respected nurse with no criminal record. She lived in the house with her husband and had every right to be there. The supposed burglary call was starting to look more and more like a tragic case of mistaken identity, but when Rodriguez tried to discuss her concerns with Sergeant Torres, she was quickly shut down. "The investigation is ongoing," Torres told her. "We can't jump to conclusions based on incomplete information. Officer Kane is a good cop who was doing his job." As the day went on, the cover-up began to take shape. Security camera footage from nearby houses mysteriously developed technical problems. The neighbor who had supposedly called in the burglary report couldn't be reached for comment, and Officer Kane was placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, a standard procedure that often lasted months. The local newspaper ran a small story about the incident on page 3, describing it as an officer-involved shooting during a burglary response. There was no mention of Lisa's profession, no details about the circumstances, and no questions about whether proper procedures had been followed. David Williams returned to an empty house that evening, trying to make sense of a world that had completely changed in the span of a few hours. He didn't know yet that his wife's death would become national news. He didn't know that his own background would eventually play a crucial role in seeking justice. And he certainly didn't know that the police department's carefully crafted story was about to fall apart. Part 3. The widower's secret. David Williams sat in his empty living room, staring at the framed photo of Lisa on the coffee table. It had been 3 days since the police told him about the incident, and he still couldn't believe she was gone. The house felt cold and lifeless without her laughter filling the rooms. Friends and neighbors had been stopping by with casseroles and condolences, but David barely registered their presence. Everyone kept saying how sorry they were and how it must have been a terrible accident. But something deep in his gut told him this wasn't just an accident. On Thursday morning, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Washington, D.C. "David, it's Director Collins from headquarters. I just heard about Lisa. I'm so sorry for your loss." David closed his eyes. He'd been dreading this call but knew it was coming. Director Collins was his boss at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and news like this traveled fast through government circles. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate you calling." "Take all the time you need," Collins said. "Your classes at Quantico can wait. Family comes first." After hanging up, David realized he'd have to start making some difficult phone calls. For the past 15 years, he'd been one of the FBI's most respected tactical instructors. His job was training the Bureau's elite hostage rescue team and teaching advanced combat techniques to special agents who worked the most dangerous cases. Most people in his neighborhood had no idea what David really did for work. When neighbors asked, Lisa would just say he worked for the government and traveled a lot for training purposes. It was easier than explaining that her husband spent his days teaching federal agents how to handle life or death situations. David's phone started ringing again. This time it was Agent Mike Chun, one of his former students who now worked on a counterterrorism task force in New York. "Boss, I just heard the news. What can I do to help?" "I appreciate it, Mike, but there's nothing anyone can do right now." "Come on, David. You taught us never to accept things at face value." "What really happened?" David paused. Mike was right. He had taught his students to question everything and dig deeper when something didn't make sense. "The police say it was a misunderstanding. Lisa was coming home from work, and an officer thought she was a burglar." "That doesn't sound right. Lisa was a nurse, right?" "She was in her own house. That's what they tell me." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Mike said something that would stick with David for weeks. "You know what you'd tell us if we brought you a story like that in training? You'd tell us to find out what really happened." After the call ended, David sat thinking about what Mike had said. For years, he'd been teaching federal agents how to investigate crimes and gather evidence. He trained them to spot inconsistencies in witness statements and to never trust official stories without verification. Now his own wife was dead, and he was just accepting what the local police told him. That evening, David's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Agent Lisa Park, another one of his former students, standing on his porch with a folder in her hands. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said. "I was in town for a conference and wanted to pay my respects." Lisa Park had been one of David's best students 5 years ago. She now worked for the FBI's Civil Rights Division, investigating cases where local police departments violated people's constitutional rights. They sat in David's kitchen, the same kitchen where his wife had died 3 days earlier. Agent Park opened her folder and pulled out several newspaper clippings. "I've been following the local news coverage of what happened," she said carefully. "There are some things that don't add up." The first article was from the local paper, describing the incident as an officer-involved shooting during a burglary response. The second was from a regional newspaper that had done a bit more digging. It mentioned that the victim was a nurse, coming home from work, and that no evidence of a burglary had been found. "The official story keeps changing," Agent Park explained. "First they said Lisa was acting suspiciously. Then they said she made threatening movements. Now they're saying the officer couldn't see clearly in the dark." David studied the articles. His years of training federal agents had taught him to recognize when people were trying to cover something up. The inconsistencies in the police departments story were exactly the kind of red flags he'd trained his students to watch for. "There's something else," Agent Park said. She pulled out a printed email. "This came through our civil rights tip line yesterday. Someone sent us information about the officer involved in the shooting." David read the email. It was from someone who claimed to work at the police department and said that Officer Kane had a history of excessive force complaints that had been covered up by supervisors. The email mentioned specific incidents where Kane had been violent with suspects but had never faced serious consequences. "We can't verify this information yet," Agent Park said. "But if it's true, it changes everything about what happened to Lisa." For the first time since his wife's death, David felt something other than grief. He felt anger starting to build in his chest. If the police department was covering up a pattern of violence, if they were protecting an officer who shouldn't have been on the streets, then Lisa's death wasn't just a tragic accident. The next morning, David made a decision that would change everything. He called his supervisor at the FBI and requested an extended leave of absence. Then he started making phone calls to people he'd trained over the years. Agent Rodriguez in Miami had specialized in organized crime investigations. Agent Thompson in Seattle was an expert in forensic evidence. Agent Jackson in Atlanta knew everything about surveillance and electronic communications. One by one, David reached out to former students who now worked in different aspects of federal law enforcement. He didn't ask them to do anything illegal or unethical. He just asked them to keep their ears open for any information about what had happened to Lisa, if there was more to the story than what the local police were saying. David wanted to know about it. By the end of the week, information started trickling in. Agent Rodriguez called to say that a contact in the police union had mentioned that Kane was known for having a short fuse with suspects. Agent Thompson found public records showing that the police department had paid out several settlements in recent years for excessive force lawsuits. The most interesting call came from Agent Williams, no relation to David despite sharing the same last name. She worked in the FBI's background investigation unit and had access to databases that tracked police officer misconduct across different jurisdictions. "I can't give you specific details," she said carefully. "But if you were to look into Officer Kane's employment history before he joined the Maple Heights Police Department, you might find some interesting information." David spent that weekend doing something he'd never imagined he'd have to do, investigating his own wife's death. He drove around the neighborhood where they lived, talking to neighbors who might have seen or heard something that night. He visited the hospital where Lisa worked and spoke with her colleagues about her final shift. What he discovered made him sick to his stomach. Lisa's coworkers told him she'd stayed late that night to help train a new nurse. She'd been in an exceptionally good mood, talking about the vacation she and David were planning for their anniversary. She'd left the hospital at 2:30 a.m., tired but happy. The neighbor who supposedly called in the burglary report couldn't be reached for comment. Just like Detective Rodriguez had discovered, other neighbors said they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual that night until the police cars arrived. Most troubling of all, David learned that Officer Kane had been involved in 3 other use-of-force incidents in the past 2 years. In each case, the department had cleared him of wrongdoing. But the pattern was unmistakable. As David sat in his car outside the police station on Sunday evening, he realized that his life was about to take a direction he'd never planned. For 15 years, he'd been teaching federal agents how to seek justice and uphold the law. Now he was going to find out if those same principles applied when the system was trying to protect itself. He pulled out his phone and called Agent Park. "I want to know everything about Officer Kane's background," he said. "And I want to know what really happened in my kitchen that night." "David, are you sure about this? Once we start digging, there's no going back. Lisa deserves the truth," David replied. "And I'm going to make sure she gets it." What David didn't know yet was that his quiet investigation was about to become the most important case of his career. His unique position in law enforcement, combined with his determination to find the truth, would soon make him the most dangerous person Officer Kane and the Maple Heights Police Department had ever encountered. Part 4. Pressure mounts. 2 weeks after Lisa's death, everything changed in one moment. David was sitting in his kitchen going through Lisa's medical journals that her colleagues had brought him when his phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made his blood run cold. Leaked video shows police shooting of unarmed nurse in her own home. David's hands shook as he clicked on the link. Someone had obtained Officer Kane's body cam footage and leaked it to Channel 7 News. The video was grainy and dark, but it told a completely different story than what the police department had been saying for 2 weeks. The footage showed Kane approaching the back door of David's house. Lisa could be heard inside calling out, "Just a minute," in a clearly tired but calm voice. When she opened the door, she was obviously surprised to see a police officer. She was still wearing her hospital scrubs, and her hospital ID badge was clearly visible around her neck. "Can I help you, officer?" Lisa asked politely. She was holding her cell phone in one hand and had the other hand on the door frame. "Step outside," Kane commanded, his voice aggressive and impatient. "I'm sorry, but this is my house. Is everything okay?" Lisa responded, confusion evident in her voice. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it would be replayed millions of times over the following days. Kane suddenly grabbed Lisa's arm and tried to pull her outside. When she instinctively pulled back and raised her phone to call for help, Kane shouted, "Gun!" and fired 3 shots. The video ended with Lisa collapsing in her doorway while Kane stood over her, breathing heavily. David watched the video 12 times before he could process what he was seeing. The police had told him that Lisa had been acting suspiciously and making threatening movements. But the video showed a tired nurse, confused about why a police officer was at her door at 3 in the morning, trying to understand what was happening. Within hours, the video had gone viral. Social media exploded with outrage, and news crews began setting up outside the Maple Heights Police Department. David's phone started ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, activists, and strangers offering their support. The first call he answered was from Agent Park. "David, have you seen the news?" "I just watched it," David replied, his voice barely steady. "This changes everything. The video completely contradicts the police department's official report. We need to talk." That afternoon, Agent Park arrived at David's house with 2 other federal agents. They sat in his living room while protesters could be heard chanting outside the police station 6 blocks away. "The Civil Rights Division is opening a formal investigation," Agent Park explained. "The video provides clear evidence that Officer Kane used excessive force against an unarmed civilian in her own home." Agent Torres, who specialized in police misconduct cases, leaned forward. "David, I need to ask you something important. We've been looking into Officer Kane's background, and we found some troubling information. Did you know that he was fired from his previous job with the county sheriff's department?" David shook his head. This was the first he'd heard about Kane having worked anywhere else. He was terminated for excessive force after he put a teenager in the hospital during a routine traffic stop. Agent Torres continued. "Somehow, Maple Heights Police hired him 6 months later without properly checking his background." The third agent, Special Agent Davis from the FBI's Criminal Investigation Unit, opened a thick folder. "We've also discovered that this isn't Kane's first shooting. 3 years ago, he shot an elderly man during a welfare check. The department ruled it justified, but the man was unarmed and suffering from dementia." David felt sick. His wife had been killed by an officer who had a history of violence, and the police department had covered it up. Why wasn't any of this information made public before? "Police departments protect their own," Agent Park said sadly. "But now that the video is public, we can force them to answer some difficult questions." The leaked video had created a perfect storm. Civil rights organizations were calling for Kane's arrest. The mayor was facing pressure to fire the police chief. And most importantly for David, the case was no longer just a local matter that could be quietly swept under the rug. That evening, David received an unexpected visitor. Detective Rodriguez, the lead investigator on Lisa's case, knocked on his door just after sunset. She looked exhausted and stressed. "Mr. Williams, I wanted to talk to you privately," she said. "Can I come in?" They sat at David's kitchen table, the same table where he and Lisa had eaten breakfast together just 3 weeks earlier. "I need to tell you something," Rodriguez said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been a detective for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like Lisa. From the moment I walked into your kitchen that night, I knew something wasn't right about Kane's story." David waited for her to continue. "I tried to investigate properly. I interviewed neighbors, collected evidence, reviewed Kane's background. But every time I tried to dig deeper, my supervisor shut me down. They told me the case was closed and that I needed to move on to other matters." Rodriguez pulled out a manila envelope. "I made copies of everything before they could make it disappear. Witness statements that contradict Kane's story. Photos of the scene that show Lisa was clearly not threatening anyone. Records of Kane's previous incidents that the department tried to bury." She slid the envelope across the table to David. "I can't do anything with this information while I'm still employed by the department, but maybe you can." David opened the envelope and found dozens of documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption and cover-up. The police department hadn't just failed to properly investigate Lisa's death, they had actively worked to hide evidence that would have exposed Kane's history of violence. "Why are you giving this to me?" David asked. "Because your wife deserved better," Rodriguez replied. "She was a good person who spent her life helping others, and she was killed by a man who should never have been wearing a badge. Someone needs to fight for her." After Rodriguez left, David spread the documents across his kitchen table and began reading. What he discovered made him angrier than he'd ever been in his life. The police department had known about Kane's problems for years, but had done nothing to stop him. There were complaint reports from citizens who said Kane had been unnecessarily aggressive during traffic stops. There were incident reports showing that Kane had been involved in more use-of-force situations than any other officer in the department. Most damning of all, there was a memo from Kane's supervisor recommending that he receive additional training in de-escalation techniques, a memo that was dated just 1 week before he killed Lisa. David's phone rang. It was Agent Chin, one of his former students who now worked in New York. "Boss, I've been watching the news. This is insane. What can we do to help?" "I don't know yet," David replied. "But I'm starting to understand that this is bigger than just what happened to Lisa. This whole department is corrupt." "You know what you always taught us?" Chun said. "When you're dealing with corruption, you have to expose all of it. Otherwise, they'll just find new ways to hide the truth." Over the next few days, the pressure on the Maple Heights Police Department continued to mount. The leaked video had been viewed over 10 million times online. Protesters gathered outside the police station every day, demanding Kane's arrest and the police chief's resignation, but the department was fighting back. They hired an expensive public relations firm to manage the crisis. They released statements, claiming that the video didn't show the full context of what happened. They suggested that Kane had been responding to intelligence about potential threats in the neighborhood. Most disturbingly, they began attacking Lisa's character. Anonymous sources within the department leaked stories claiming that Lisa had been acting erratically that night and that she had a history of mental health issues. None of it was true, but the lies spread quickly through social media and right-wing news outlets. David watched in horror as his wife's reputation was destroyed by people who had never met her. Lisa had been one of the most respected nurses at the hospital, known for her kindness and professionalism. Now, strangers on the internet were calling her a drug addict and claiming she had been high the night she died. The character assassination was the final straw for David. He had been willing to work within the system and let the federal investigation take its course. But seeing his wife's memory being destroyed by the same people who had covered up her killer's history made him realize that playing by the rules wasn't going to be enough. That night, David made a decision that would change everything. He called Agent Park and asked for a meeting with her supervisors in Washington. It was time to stop being a grieving widower and start being what he'd been trained to be, a federal agent who knew how to take down corrupt organizations. "I want to help with the investigation," he told Agent Park. "I want to use everything I know to make sure these people face justice." "David, are you sure?" "Once you become officially involved, you'll be a target. They'll try to destroy you the same way they're trying to destroy Lisa's memory." "Let them try," David replied. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." The war between David Williams and the Maple Heights Police Department was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since Lisa's death. Part 5. The investigation deepens 3 weeks after the bodycam video went viral. David Williams found himself in a place he never thought he'd be, sitting across from federal prosecutor Elena Rodriguez in a secure conference room at the FBI field office. The room was windowless and sterile, designed for discussing the most sensitive criminal cases. Elena had been prosecuting civil rights violations for 12 years. She was known for taking on cases that other prosecutors wouldn't touch, especially when they involved police corruption. When she saw the leaked video of Lisa's death, she knew immediately that this case could set an important precedent. "Mr. Williams, I want you to understand what you're getting into," Elena said, opening a thick file folder. "If we move forward with federal charges against Officer Kane and potentially others in the department, this will become one of the most watched civil rights cases in the country." David nodded. He'd spent the past month learning things about the legal system that he wished he never had to know. "I understand the risks. But I also understand that if we don't fight this, other families will go through what I'm going through." Elena studied David's face. She'd worked with federal agents before, but this situation was unique. David wasn't just a grieving widower. He was someone with extensive training in investigation techniques and connections throughout law enforcement. That could be either very helpful or very dangerous. "Tell me what you've discovered in your own investigation," Elena said. David pulled out a folder that had grown thick with documents over the past month. Officer Kane has a pattern of violence that goes back at least 5 years. Before he worked in Maple Heights, he was fired from the county sheriff's department for putting a 17-year-old boy in the hospital during a routine traffic stop. He spread photos across the table showing the teenager's injuries, a broken jaw, fractured ribs, and severe bruising on his face and arms. The boy was pulled over for a broken taillight. Kane claimed the kid was resisting arrest, but security camera footage from a nearby business showed the kid had his hands up the entire time. Elena examined the photos carefully. Why wasn't Kane criminally charged? The sheriff's department covered it up. They said the boy was on drugs and had become violent, but toxicology reports showed he was completely clean. The family sued and got a settlement, but Kane was just quietly fired and moved on to the next job. David flipped to another section of his file. That's just the beginning. I found at least 6 other incidents where Kane used excessive force, including the shooting of an elderly man with dementia that Agent Torres mentioned. Elena was taking notes rapidly. How did you get access to all this information? I have friends in a lot of places, David said simply. When you spend 15 years training federal agents, you build a network of people who know how to find information. What David didn't mention was the extent of that network. Over the past month, former students of his from across the country had been quietly gathering intelligence on Kane and the Maple Heights Police Department. Agent Chen in New York had used his organized crime contacts to trace Kane's employment. History, Agent Williams in D.C. had run background checks through federal databases. Agent Thompson in Seattle had even traveled to Kane's hometown to interview people who had known him growing up. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Kane had been a problem officer everywhere he'd worked, but police departments kept hiring him because other departments wouldn't share information about why he'd been fired. It was a pattern that allowed dangerous officers to move from job to job, leaving a trail of victims behind them. There's something else, David said, pulling out a new set of documents. The Maple Heights Police Department has been covering up problem officers for years. Kane isn't the only one. Elena looked at the papers David handed her. They showed a pattern of misconduct complaints, excessive force lawsuits, and internal investigations that always seemed to clear officers of wrongdoing. In the past 5 years alone, the department had paid out over $2 million in settlements for officer misconduct. How did you get internal police department documents? Elena asked. Detective Rodriguez has been very helpful, David replied carefully. She's been documenting the corruption for years, waiting for someone who could do something about it. Elena knew she was looking at a potential goldmine of evidence, but she also knew it had to be obtained legally to be useful in court. Mr. Williams, I need to be very clear about something. Any evidence we use in this case has to be gathered through proper legal channels. I can't use information that was obtained illegally, no matter how damaging it might be. I understand, David said. Everything I'm giving you was either obtained through public records, requests, or provided voluntarily by people within the system who want to see justice done. Over the next 2 hours, David and Elena went through every piece of evidence. Phone records showing that Kane had called in sick the day he was supposed to attend de-escalation training. Witness statements from other officers who had seen Kane lose his temper during arrests. Even psychological evaluations that recommended Kane receive anger management counseling. Recommendations that were ignored by his supervisors. The most damaging evidence came from Kane's own personnel file. David had obtained it through a contact in the police union who was disgusted by what had happened to Lisa. The file showed that Kane had been the subject of 17 separate complaints in his 6 years with the Maple Heights Police Department. In each case, the internal investigation had found that Kane's actions were within department policy. This is systematic, Elena said, studying the pattern of complaints and cover-ups. It's not just Kane who needs to be charged. The supervisors who protected him are just as guilty. Elena opened her laptop and showed David a federal statute she'd been researching. Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code makes it a federal crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights. That includes not just the officer who pulled the trigger, but anyone who helped cover it up. David felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. You're talking about charging the supervisors too? I'm talking about charging everyone who was part of this conspiracy, Elena said firmly. Your wife's civil rights were violated the moment Kane decided to use deadly force against an unarmed woman in her own home. But the violation continued when his supervisors helped cover up what he did. Elena closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. Mr. Williams, I'm going to offer you something that I've never offered a victim's family member before. I want you to work with our investigation team as a consultant. David was surprised. What does that mean exactly? It means you'll have access to our investigation files and you'll be able to help us understand the law enforcement angle of this case. Your training and connections could be invaluable in building a case that will actually succeed in court. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. But it also means you'll be taking on significant personal risk. Police departments don't like federal investigations, and they especially don't like when one of their own victims fights back. They'll try to discredit you, investigate your background, and make your life as difficult as possible. David thought about Lisa and how excited she'd been about their upcoming anniversary vacation. He thought about the lies the police department was spreading about her mental health and character. He thought about the other families who might face the same tragedy if Kane and officers like him weren't stopped. What do I need to do? David asked. Elena smiled for the first time since the meeting began. First, we need to get you officially sworn in as a federal consultant. Then we need to start building the strongest civil rights case this country has seen in years. As they left the conference room, Elena stopped in the hallway. Mr. Williams, there's one more thing you should know. The Maple Heights Police Department hired a private investigation firm to dig into your background. They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you. David wasn't surprised. Let them look. My record is clean, and everything I've done in this investigation has been legal and proper. I'm sure it is, Elena said. But they're not just looking at your professional life. They're going to investigate your marriage, your finances, your friends, everything. They want to find something, anything, that they can use to make you look bad. David nodded grimly. He trained federal agents for 15 years, and he knew how these investigations worked. The difference was that now he was the target instead of investigator. There's something they don't understand, David said as they walked toward the elevator. I've been training people to investigate corruption and bring down criminal organizations for my entire career. They picked the wrong person to mess with. Elena pressed the elevator button and turned to David with a serious expression. Mr. Williams, we're about to go to war with an entire police department and possibly the local government that protects them. Are you absolutely sure you're ready for that? David thought about Lisa one more time, her smile when she left for work that last morning, her dedication to helping patients, her dreams for their future together. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Part 6. Allies and Enemies. David Williams never expected to receive a death threat in his own mailbox. But there it was on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after Lisa's death, a plain white envelope with no return address containing a single sheet of paper with 5 words typed in black letters, "Stop digging or join her." He sat on his front porch steps, holding the letter, watching his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, water her flowers across the street. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. But David's world had become anything but normal since he'd started working. With the federal investigation, his phone rang. It was Agent Chung calling from New York. "Boss, we have a problem. Someone's been asking questions about you at the training facility in Virginia. They wanted to know about your psychological evaluations, your firearms qualifications, anything that might make you look unstable or dangerous." David wasn't surprised. Elena had warned him this would happen. What did they find? Nothing useful. For them, your record is spotless. But they're getting desperate, which means they're probably going to try something else. After hanging up, David walked back into his house and looked around the living room where he and Lisa had spent so many quiet evenings together. The federal investigation was moving forward, but it was taking a toll on everyone involved. Elena Rodriguez was working 18-hour days building the case. Detective Rodriguez had been transferred to a desk job after it became clear she was cooperating with the feds. And David was learning that seeking justice came with a price he hadn't expected to pay. That afternoon, David received an unexpected visitor. Captain Morrison from the Maple Heights Police Department knocked on his door, accompanied by two officers David didn't recognize. "Mr. Williams, we need to talk," Morrison said when David opened the door. They sat in David's living room, the same room where he'd met with federal agents just days earlier. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. The federal agents had come to help him seek justice, while these local officers were clearly there to intimidate him. "You're making a lot of trouble for good officers," Morrison began. "Officer Kane is a decorated veteran who served his country overseas. He's got a wife and kids, and you're trying to destroy his life over a tragic accident." David kept his voice calm, drawing on years of training in dealing with hostile subjects. "It wasn't an accident, Captain. Your officer killed my wife in her own kitchen while she was trying to call 911. Kane was doing his job," Morrison replied. "He responded to a burglary call and encountered someone acting suspiciously in a dark house. He had to make a split-second decision to protect himself." "There was no burglary," David said firmly. "Lisa was coming home from work. She was wearing hospital scrubs and had her ID badge around her neck. She told Kane it was her house." Morrison's expression hardened. "You weren't there, Mr. Williams. You don't know what Kane saw or what he was thinking, but I know what you've been doing. Running around the country, gathering information, working with federal agents to destroy the reputation of this department." One of the other officers spoke for the first time. "We know about your background, Williams. You train killers for the government. Maybe you're the one who's dangerous. Maybe your wife was scared of you that night." David felt his anger rising, but kept it under control. These officers were trying to provoke him, hoping he'd say or do something they could use against him. "My wife loved me, and I loved her. We had a good marriage and a good life until your officer murdered her." "That's a serious accusation," Morrison said. "You better be careful about making statements you can't prove." "I can prove everything," David replied. "And I will." After the police left, David called Elena Rodriguez immediately. She listened to his account of the meeting with growing concern. "They're trying to rattle you," Elena said. "This is a classic intimidation tactic. They want you to back down or do something stupid that they can use against you." "I'm not backing down," David said. "But I need to know, am I putting other people at risk by continuing this fight?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "David, I'm going to be honest with you. Yes, there are risks. Not just to you, but to everyone involved in this case. Detective Rodriguez has been getting anonymous phone calls at home. The medical examiner who performed Lisa's autopsy had someone break into her car. Even I've had to change my daily routine because I think I'm being followed." David felt a wave of guilt wash over him. "Maybe I should step back. I don't want other people to get hurt because of me." "No," Elena said firmly. "That's exactly what they want. If good people back down every time corrupt cops try to intimidate them, then the corruption wins. Your wife deserves better than that." The next day brought an unexpected development that reminded David he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Agent Park called with news that would change everything. "David, you need to turn on Channel 7 News right now." David grabbed his remote and switched to the local news station. A reporter was standing outside the police station with a microphone, interviewing a young woman David didn't recognize. "This is Katie Morrison, a former Maple Heights police dispatcher who says she has important information about the night Lisa Thompson was killed," the reporter said. David turned up the volume as Katie began speaking. "I was working the dispatch desk the night of the shooting. The call that Officer Kane responded to wasn't a burglary report. It was a noise complaint about a dog barking. Someone in the neighborhood called about a dog that wouldn't stop barking, and somehow that got changed to a burglary in progress. David's mouth fell open. The entire justification for Kane's presence at his house that night had been a lie. KD continued. I tried to tell my supervisor about the mistake, but he told me to keep quiet. He said it would just confuse things and that Officer Kane had already filed his report. But I made copies of the original dispatch logs because I knew something wasn't right. The reporter asked Katie why she was coming forward now. Because I can't sleep at night knowing that an innocent woman died because of our mistake and that we covered it up. Lisa Thompson was murdered and her family deserves to know the truth. David's phone started ringing immediately. It was Elena Rodriguez. Did you see the news? Elena asked excitedly. I saw it. This proves that everything Kane said about responding to a burglary was a lie. It's bigger than that, Elena said. It proves that the department knew they were covering up a lie and they did it anyway. That's conspiracy to violate civil rights, which is a federal felony. But Katie Morrison's revelation also brought new dangers. That evening, David received a call from Agent Chun with disturbing news. Boss, Katie Morrison was arrested 2 hours ago. They're saying she stole department property when she made copies of those dispatch logs. David felt his heart sink. They're trying to discredit her before her testimony can help our case. It gets worse, Chun continued. Her car was vandalized last night. Someone spray-painted traitor on her windshield and slashed her tires. David realized that the stakes were escalating rapidly. The police department wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were going after anyone who tried to help. Expose the truth. The next morning brought another surprise. David opened his front door to find Agent Rodriguez, the detective who had been helping with his case, standing on his porch with a suitcase. I've been suspended pending an internal investigation, she said. They're claiming I leaked confidential information to the federal authorities. David invited her in and made coffee while she explained what had happened. They went through my computer, my phone, my desk, everything. They're looking for any evidence that I've been working with you and the federal investigators. The police union is demanding that I be fired. I'm sorry, David said. This is my fault. No, it's not, Rodriguez replied firmly. This is the fault of a corrupt system that protects bad cops and punishes good ones. I knew what I was risking when I decided to help you. Rodriguez opened her suitcase and pulled out one final folder. Before they took my computer, I made copies of everything. Every report, every witness statement, every piece of evidence that shows how this department has been covering up Kane's history of violence. David looked through the documents and realized he was holding the smoking gun that could bring down not just Kane, but the entire command structure that had protected him. There's one more thing, Rodriguez said. I heard through the grapevine that Internal Affairs is opening an investigation into you. They're going to claim that you've been using your federal connections to illegally obtain police department information. David nodded grimly. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side were corrupt police officials who would do anything to protect themselves. On the other side were David, Elena Rodriguez, Detective Rodriguez, Katie Morrison, and a growing number of federal agents who were determined to see justice done. The war for justice was about to enter its most dangerous phase. And David was beginning to understand that seeking the truth about his wife's death meant taking on an entire system of corruption that would fight back with everything it had. But as he looked at the photo of Lisa on his mantelpiece, David knew he would see this fight through to the end, no matter what it cost him. Part 7. The trial 6 months after Lisa's death. David Williams walked up the steps of the federal courthouse for the first day of what the media was calling the trial of the decade. News vans lined the street, protesters held signs demanding justice, and security guards checked everyone entering the building. David had never imagined that seeking justice for his wife would become a national spectacle. Federal prosecutor Elena Rodriguez had spent 4 months building what she called an airtight case against Officer Kane and 3 of his supervisors. The charges were serious: violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and falsifying federal documents. If convicted, Kane could face life in prison. David's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie outside the courthouse. Agent Park, who had become his closest ally during the investigation, noticed his nervousness. "You ready for this?" she asked. "I've been ready since the night they told me Lisa was dead," David replied. "But seeing all these cameras and reporters makes it feel real in a way it hasn't before." Inside the courtroom, David was surprised by how ordinary everything looked. After months of preparation, he'd expected something more dramatic than wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights. But as he took his seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, he felt the weight of what was about to happen. Judge Harrison was known for running a tight courtroom and not tolerating games from either side. She'd been on the federal bench for 15 years and had handled several high-profile police misconduct cases. Elena had told David that getting Judge Harrison was a good sign. She wouldn't be intimidated by political pressure or media attention. The defense table was crowded. Kane had 3 lawyers, including a former federal prosecutor who specialized in defending police officers. Captain Morrison and the other supervisors each had their own attorneys. David counted 8 defense lawyers total, all wearing expensive suits and looking confident. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison," the bailiff announced as the judge entered. David felt his heart racing. This was it, the moment when everything he'd worked for over the past 6 months would be put to the test. Elena Rodriguez stood to deliver her opening statement. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her voice filled the courtroom with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a fundamental principle that makes our democracy work, that no one is above the law, not police officers, not supervisors, not anyone who wears a badge and swears to protect and serve." Elena walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. On the night of March 15th, Lisa Thompson came home from her job as a nurse at City General Hospital. She had spent 12 hours saving lives and helping people in their darkest moments. She was tired. She was looking forward to seeing her husband the next day, and she was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. David watched the jurors' faces as Elena continued. Some were taking notes, others were staring intently at her, all seemed engaged. Officer Kane didn't just kill Lisa Thompson that night. He killed her, and then he lied about it. He lied to his supervisors, he lied in his official report, and he lied to investigators. But worse than that, his supervisors helped him lie. They covered up evidence, they intimidated witnesses, and they tried to destroy the reputation of a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. Elena paused and pointed toward the defense table. "The evidence will show that this wasn't a split-second mistake by a scared police officer. This was a pattern of violence by an officer who should never have been on the street, protected by supervisors who cared more about the department's reputation than about justice." When Elena finished, Kane's lead attorney, Michael Stevens, stood for his opening statement. Stevens was a former prosecutor himself and knew how to talk to juries. "Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Kane is a decorated veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a police officer. He has dedicated his life to protecting people and keeping communities safe. On the night in question, he responded to what he believed was a burglary in progress." Stevens walked over to stand near Kane, putting his hand on his client's shoulder. Officer Kane had no way of knowing who was inside that house. He couldn't see clearly in the darkness. When someone inside made sudden movements that appeared threatening, he had less than 2 seconds to decide whether to protect himself or risk leaving his own wife a widow. David felt his anger rising as Stevens continued to paint Kane as the victim. But Elena had prepared him for this. The defense would try to make the jury sympathize with Kane while portraying Lisa as threatening or suspicious. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Officer Kane is some kind of monster," Stevens said. "But the evidence will show that he's a good man who made a difficult decision under impossible circumstances. In America, we don't send police officers to prison for doing their jobs." The first week of testimony was brutal for David to sit through. The prosecution called witness after witness to establish the timeline of events and Kane's history of violence. Katie Morrison, the former dispatcher, testified about how the original call was a noise complaint that somehow became a burglary report. Her voice shook as she described being pressured to stay quiet about the mistake. Dr. Patricia Coleman, the medical examiner who performed Lisa's autopsy, testified about the trajectory of the bullets and the distance from which Cain had fired. Her testimony made it clear that Lisa had been shot while standing in her own doorway, not advancing toward Cain as he had claimed, but the most powerful testimony came from Lisa's colleagues at the hospital. Nurse Janet Wilson had worked with Lisa for 5 years and described her as the gentlest person I've ever known. Dr. Richards, the emergency room supervisor, talked about how Lisa had stayed late that night to help train a new nurse. Emphasizing her dedication to helping others, David had to leave the courtroom twice during the first week, once when they played the body cam video for the jury, and once when they showed photos of Lisa's body. Elena had warned him that the evidence would be graphic, but seeing it presented in court was different from reviewing it in preparation meetings. The second week brought David's testimony, which Elena had said would be the most important moment of the trial. David had testified in court before as an expert witness in other cases, but never as a victim's family member and never with so much at stake. Elena walked him through his background first, his 15 years training federal agents, his spotless record, his marriage to Lisa. She wanted the jury to understand that David was a credible witness who knew how law enforcement investigations were supposed to work. "Mr. Williams, tell the jury about your wife," Elena said. David looked at the jury and took a deep breath. "Lisa was the best person I've ever known. She became a nurse because she wanted to help people. She worked night shifts in the emergency room, which meant dealing with gunshot victims, overdoses, car accidents, the worst situations you can imagine. But she never complained because she knew she was making a difference." David's voice got stronger as he continued. "She was excited about our 10-year anniversary that was coming up. We had planned a vacation to Italy that she'd been talking about for months. She was looking forward to having kids in a couple of years. She had her whole life ahead of her." Elena then asked David about his investigation into Cain's background. David methodically walked the jury through everything he'd discovered: Cain's firing from his previous job, the pattern of excessive force complaints, the cover-ups by supervisors. "As someone who has trained federal agents for 15 years, what was your assessment of the Maple Heights Police Department's investigation into your wife's death?" Elena asked. "It wasn't an investigation," David replied firmly. "It was a cover-up from the moment it started. They destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and lied about what happened. Everything they did was designed to protect Officer Cain, instead of finding the truth." The cross-examination was aggressive. Stephen spent 3 hours trying to make David look like a vengeful husband who was using his federal connections to destroy an innocent police officer. But David's training had prepared him for hostile questioning, and he remained calm and factual throughout. "Isn't it true, Mr. Williams, that you've used your position to pressure federal agents into helping you pursue a personal vendetta against Officer Cain?" Stevens asked. "No, that's not true," David replied. "I provided information to federal investigators who were already looking into civil rights violations. Everything I did was legal and proper." "But you're not exactly an objective witness, are you? You want Officer Cain to pay for what happened to your wife." David looked directly at Stevens. "I want justice for my wife. I want the truth to come out. And I want to make sure that what happened to Lisa doesn't happen to anyone else." The prosecution rested their case after 2 weeks of testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Cain's history of violence, the lies in his official report, the cover-up by his supervisors, and the body cam video that contradicted everything the department had claimed. But as the defense began presenting their case, David realized that the fight wasn't over. Stevens called character witnesses for Cain, fellow officers who testified about his service record and his dedication to the job. Part 8. Justice and Reckoning. The courtroom was packed on the final day of testimony. David Williams sat in his usual seat behind the prosecution table. watching as federal prosecutor Elena Rodriguez prepared to call her surprise rebuttal witness. For 3 weeks, the defense had tried to paint Officer Kane as a hero who made a tragic mistake. But Elena had saved her most devastating evidence for last. "The prosecution calls Officer Brian Hayes to the stand," Elena announced. David turned to see a uniformed police officer walking toward the witness stand. Hayes was young, maybe 30 years old, with the nervous look of someone who was about to do something that would change his life forever. Hayes was sworn in and identified himself as a patrol officer with the Maple Heights Police Department. Elena approached the witness stand slowly, building suspense. "Officer Hayes, how long have you worked with the Maple Heights Police Department?" 3 years, Hayes replied, his voice barely audible. "And during that time, did you ever work with Officer Kane?" "Yes, ma'am. He was my training officer when I first joined the department." Elena nodded. "Officer Hayes, I want you to tell the jury about an incident that occurred on February 20th of this year, 3 weeks before Lisa Thompson was killed." Hayes took a deep breath and looked directly at the jury. "Kane and I responded to a domestic violence call. A woman had called 911 saying her boyfriend was threatening her. When we arrived, the boyfriend was already gone, but the woman was upset and crying. What happened next? Kane told the woman she was overreacting and that she shouldn't waste police time with family arguments. When she tried to explain that she was afraid for her safety, Kane grabbed her arm and told her to shut up." David could see several jurors leaning forward, paying close attention to Hayes' testimony. "The woman pulled away from Kane and he got angry. He shoved her against the wall and told her that if she didn't stop being dramatic, he'd arrest her for filing a false report." Elena paused to let this sink in. "What did you do, Officer Hayes?" I didn't do anything," Hayes said, his voice filled with shame. "I was new and Kane was supposed to be training me. I thought maybe this was normal or maybe I was seeing it wrong." "Did you file a report about Kane's behavior?" "No, ma'am. Kane told me that what happened was between us and that new officers needed to learn when to keep their mouths shut." Elena walked closer to the witness stand. "Officer Hayes, why are you testifying today?" Hayes looked over at Kane, who was staring at him with undisguised hatred. "Because when I saw the video of what happened to Lisa Thompson, I realized that Kane had done the same thing to her that he did to that woman in February. And if I had spoken up then, maybe Lisa Thompson would still be alive." The defense attorney, Stevens, jumped up to object, but Judge Harrison overruled him. The damage was done. Hayes had just testified that Kane had a pattern of being violent with innocent people, and that the department's culture encouraged officers to cover for each other. During cross-examination, Stevens tried to destroy Hayes' credibility by suggesting he was lying to get attention or advance his career. But Hayes remained calm and consistent in his testimony, even when Stevens accused him of betraying his fellow officers. "Officer Hayes, isn't it true that you're only testifying because the federal prosecutors promised you immunity from prosecution?" Stevens asked. "No, sir. I'm testifying because it's the right thing to do," Hayes replied. "I took an oath to protect and serve, and staying quiet about Kane's behavior would be breaking that oath." After Hayes' testimony, Elena called one final witness, former Captain Robert Miller, who had retired from the Maple Heights Police Department just 2 months after Lisa's death. Miller had been Kane's supervisor and was one of the defendants, charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, but Miller had decided to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was devastating for the remaining defendants. "Captain Miller, tell the jury about the meeting that took place the morning after Lisa Thompson was killed." Elena said. Miller looked uncomfortable but answered clearly. "Chief Patterson called a meeting with myself, Sergeant Torres, and Lieutenant Johnson. He told us that Kane's story about responding to a burglary didn't match the dispatch records." "What did Chief Patterson say should be done about this discrepancy?" "He said we needed to stick to Kane's version of events. He said it would be a disaster for the department if it came out that Kane had killed an innocent woman based on a mistaken dispatch call." Elena walked Miller through the entire cover-up, how they had pressured Katie Morrison to stay quiet about the dispatch error, how they had destroyed Kane's previous disciplinary files, and how they had spread lies about Lisa's mental health to discredit her. Captain Miller, at any point during this cover-up, did anyone suggest that the right thing to do would be to tell the truth about what happened? Miller shook his head. No, ma'am. The only concern was protecting the department's reputation and keeping Kane out of trouble. The defense's cross-examination of Miller was brief. There wasn't much they could do to challenge his testimony since he had been part of the conspiracy himself. Elena Rodriguez delivered her closing argument on a Thursday morning. She spoke for 2 hours, methodically going through every piece of evidence that proved Kane had murdered Lisa and that his supervisors had helped cover it up. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than just one corrupt police officer, Elena said as she concluded her argument. This case is about whether we live in a country where people in positions of power can kill innocent citizens and escape justice by lying and covering up their crimes. Elena pointed toward David, who was sitting in his usual spot in the front row. David Williams lost his wife because a violent police officer was allowed to stay on the street by supervisors who cared more about protecting their own interests than protecting the public. But David didn't just grieve and move on. He fought for the truth even when it put him in danger. Elena turned back to the jury. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. Officer Kane murdered Lisa Thompson in cold blood, and his supervisors helped him cover it up. I'm asking you to hold them accountable for their crimes and to send a message that no one, not even police officers, is above the law. The defense closing arguments lasted 3 hours, with each defendant's lawyer trying to shift blame to someone else. Kane's lawyer, Stevens, made one final attempt to portray his client as a victim of overzealous federal prosecutors. Officer Kane made a mistake, Stevens said. But mistakes are not crimes. This man served his country in Afghanistan and then came home to serve his community as a police officer. He doesn't deserve to spend the rest of his life in prison for doing his job. But after 3 weeks of testimony, Stevens's arguments fell flat. The evidence was too strong, and the defense had no real way to explain away the body cam video or the systematic cover-up that followed. Lisa's death, the jury deliberated for 2 days. David spent those 48 hours pacing around his house, unable to eat or sleep. Elena called him every few hours with updates, but there was nothing to report except that the jury was still deliberating. On Saturday afternoon, David's phone rang. It was Elena. The jury has reached a verdict, she said. We need to be at the courthouse in an hour. David drove to the courthouse in a daze. The past 9 months had consumed his entire life. The investigation, the preparation for trial, the testimony. Now it was almost over. One way or another, the courtroom was packed as Judge Harrison asked the jury foreman to read the verdicts. David held his breath as the foreman stood up. On the charge of violation of civil rights under color of law, we find the defendant Robert Kane guilty. David felt his legs go weak. Lisa was finally going to get justice. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant Robert Kane guilty. The verdicts continued for 20 minutes. Kane was found guilty on all charges. Captain Morrison was found guilty of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Sergeant Torres was found guilty on 2 of 3 charges. Lieutenant Johnson was convicted of falsifying federal documents. Kane showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but David could see his hands shaking. When Judge Harrison announced that sentencing would take place in 6 weeks, Kane finally looked back at David for the first time during the entire trial. David stared back at the man who had killed his wife, feeling not satisfaction but a deep sense of relief that the truth had finally been acknowledged. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded David, asking how he felt about the verdict. I feel like Lisa finally got the justice she deserved, David said. But this isn't just about my wife. This is about making sure that corrupt police officers can't hide behind their badges when they commit crimes. Elena Rodriguez joined David on the courthouse steps. The verdicts today send a clear message that civil rights violations will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, no matter who commits them. A reporter asked David what he planned to do next. I'm going to make sure that what happened To Lisa never happens to another family, David replied. I'm starting a foundation in her name to provide legal assistance to families who are victims of police violence, and to advocate for reforms that will prevent corrupt officers from staying